Welcome, everybody. We're already underway. We are at noon. Gonna allow one more minute for some attendees to start trickling in. And very, very excited for you all to meet our guests today, Mara, Ed, and Jonathan.
Hello.
Hey, Jonathan. He's excited to get going here.
Always.
All right, so we'll go ahead and just do a quick welcome to everyone in the attendee list. I see some familiar faces, but for those of you who haven't attended one of our FedTech Fireside chat yet, I'm Robin Brazil. I'm a director here at FedTech. We are a deep tech innovation platform that service the needs of commercializing deep tech from the very early inception within our research labs and all the way into spin-out creation and acceleration of established companies. So why are we doing this series? So during the times of COVID, like everybody else, we wanted a way to have these informal sessions to celebrate the journeys of some seasoned entrepreneurs, bring our community together, connect individuals that are in the same space, and share some advice for those that are coming up against challenges as you are taking your own entrepreneurial journey. So I'm very excited that in the past several months, we've been able to partner with JLab's Blue Night, and I'm going to welcome Rachel here to say a quick hello. We've been doing several editions of the FedTech Fireside chats with Blue Night and really focusing on what it is to be a successful health tech entrepreneur and trying to share stories and experiences from those in the community that are going through this very unique journey. So this is one of those sessions. So going to hear from some seasoned entrepreneurs and former FDA director about what we need to do to look at that as part of your strategy when establishing a health tech startup. So we're going to dive into that shortly, but wanted to welcome Rachel Rath to the virtual stage just to say a quick hello and let y'all know what is cooking over at Blue Night.
Thanks, Robin, and it's really a pleasure to be here today and get to attend to this fantastic panel. So really quickly, before we dive into the great discussion, Blue Night is a joint initiative between Johnson & Johnson Innovation JLabs and BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We launched Blue Night back in August of 2020 with the goal of supporting early stage companies and entrepreneurs working on the next generation of solutions for the future pandemics and emerging health threats that we may or may not know about yet coming our way in the next couple years. So our idea is really, how do we support innovators, entrepreneurs today in developing solutions against those potential health threats of the future? We do that through a variety of different ways, whether that's through physical or virtual residency opportunities, through day labs, through educational programming like the one today, and we're really pleased to partner with FedTech on today's webinar and other webinars we've done together as well. So with that, please enjoy the conversation. I know I'm looking forward to it, and I'll pass it back to Robin.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand it over to our guests to introduce themselves, but really quick for the audience, you'll see that we have enabled the Q&A function. You'll see Swami, one of our entrepreneurs, actually getting it going with a chat. Please use that to ask questions as we go to the panelists. Please know I have a few starter questions that we're going to get into the experiences of all three of our guests, and then we're going to open it up to the audience Q&A. But go ahead and put those questions in as we get going here. Just know that I'm going to dive into them a little bit later in the discussion. So I'm going to hand it over now for some introductions to our guests. So Mara, you are kind of first here on my little bobblehead bubbles here. So if you would please just give the audience a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to the role that you're in today.
Absolutely, it would be my pleasure. And thank you so much to both FedTech, to JLabs and the Blue Night program for inviting me here today. I am so grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit of my experience and to be part of the panel. But just as by means of a little bit of introduction, I wanted to give you a snapshot of my background. I started my career as a mechanical engineer designing products actually for Johnson & Johnson. So I have a lot of love for J&J. I early in my career worked for them as both a product design engineer and a manufacturing engineer, making endovascular stents primarily. After I got my MBA, I moved more into the leadership side of the medical device world. I led the life support ventilation business unit for Philips Healthcare for many years. But like many people on this call, I'm sure I got that entrepreneurial bug, and I loved having the experience of working at really large companies behind me. I had the opportunity while I was at Johnson & Johnson to work on 510Ks, a PMA submission, and actually one HDE or humanitarian device exemption. So I got to see a lot of different things and be part of those. Similarly, when I was with Philips, I worked on several 510Ks for both devices and software as a medical device. So I got to touch a lot of different varieties of submissions. When I transitioned more into entrepreneurship, I have been lucky enough to work with a consumer robotics company, a digital health startup focusing on behavioral health around insomnia and insomnia care. And currently, I'm CEO of Endolumik. We are a surgical device company that makes surgical devices that utilize near infrared light to enhance the visualization of devices during surgery. So we are ramping up for our first 510K submission this fall, hopefully. So very deep in the process, and have really gotten to see working with the FDA from all different sides, both in large companies and now as an entrepreneur with several different types of submissions. So I'm so excited to be part of this panel, hear from these great experts, and look forward to talking with all of you.
Thank you, Mara. And you are an expert too. So that's why you're here. Really want to hear some of your different experiences. So Ed, if you don't mind kind of jumping in with a little bit about your background.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to participate today. So my name is Ed Gillen. I'm currently the CEO of a company called Grip Molecular. We're developing a novel technology that can be used for home-based diagnostics. So I've been in the medical device field for 35 years. I started off in product management with two early stage companies. I was actually responsible for launching what I believe was the first biologically active implant many years ago, and had the opportunity to go through the Office of Combination Products, which was new at the FDA at the time, to bring that product to commercialization. I had a 23-year career at Becton Dickinson in a wide variety of roles. So I was in product management, general management. I was responsible for strategy development for the medical segment of Becton Dickinson, which was and still is today the largest segment of Becton Dickinson. Had a chance to bring some new products to market while at Becton Dickinson, coming out of our technology center, Research Triangle Park. So it was kind of an entrepreneurial experience, if you will, and was responsible for business development at a point in my career there, and also for digital health. So that was an introduction to the world of apps and HIPAA compliant communications, and all those things. Went through a lot of, I'd say, the evolution of thought about that, which was evolving quite rapidly during that time period at the FDA. And I think has settled down quite a bit in a very positive way from my perspective. I retired from Becton Dickinson about 4 years ago, and then was pulled in. I guess it was my entrepreneurial spirit. I got pulled in into a couple of different activities. The first was leading a company that is pursuing surgical reversal of type 2 diabetes. So a surgical intervention and a medical device to do so. And so that was quite interesting. And had significant interactions with the FDA in that process. And then most recently with Grip Molecular, we are getting ready for our 510K submission. So we're not yet at that stage, but going through all the steps that are appropriate to prepare for those regulatory interactions, both here in the US and in Europe. So that's a quick overview of my background, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Ed. And Jonathan, to kind of round us out, and then perfect tee up for those who might not know what 510K is. That'll be kind of the first question, but if you can kind of end with a a summary of that pathway.
Sure, and wanted to thank my esteemed colleagues and luminaries. Really, it's a privilege to join them on this panel. A lot of overlap that I think will be synergistic for this discussion. And I really do believe that this partnership, the J&J, BARDA, Blue Knight, J Labs, is a testament to the value of public-private partnerships. And really, that's reflective sort of over, the tenure of my career at the agency. Spent just an internship at the NIH before I transitioned, developing the pre-market software review program almost 20 years ago, well, not quite 20 years ago, where, again, evaluating software as a medical device, a component, standalone, accessory. The terms digital health, these acronyms didn't even exist at the time. And the real value was understanding the common denominators across the different review divisions. First of all, again, I think we all share passions for developing novel solutions, for helping to fill unmet clinical needs. And I think, again, agency very much not just, is part of its core mission to do that, but, having really this once in a lifetime opportunity to learn from all the different review divisions across the therapeutic areas, because software cuts across cardiac and imaging and implantables and general hospital. It was a unique perspective that allowed me to apply that both when I was in public service. And as a side note, highly recommend anybody who's interested in considering positions at the agency, whether it's either as internships or full-time positions that are, again, available really throughout the entire career span, both for folks sort of, at the end or at the beginning. And really, again, really great way to serve, again, those that are also share the passion of public health. Great way to do so. But had an opportunity to actually leave Center for Devices and work with Dr. Woodcock at the Center for Drugs, where I eventually became the Associate Director for Risk Science, where I helped really establish a lot of the digital health policies, if you will, more focused on e-clinical and the use of systems in FDA-regulated clinical research. And whether it's on the investigational, inspectional side, or even, the novel topics these days, of course, of remote clinical studies, real-world data, real-world evidence, just buzzwords, how to leverage EHR data, to really support expansion of marketing indications. So again, this was, I swear to you, I thought I was going to retire at the agency, but it's just like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can't ever leave. And so even though I spent the last 8 years in industry where I've had to, in many ways, just apply my knowledge, dare I say, in the ivory tower of the FDA, where, again, cutting across both centers, where likewise I was exposed to understanding all of the life cycle review points within both devices and drugs. And I'm also faculty at Johns Hopkins, where I am the coordinator and senior lecturer for the graduate program in regulatory science, and also the representative and the elected vice president of the Association of Graduate Regulatory Educators, which again kind of brings me to my original point about how critical it is for public-private partnerships, again, to come together like this, to share thoughts, engage, really allows, again, all the seeds that are planted to be able to grow. And, navigating this is extremely difficult. There, frankly, not to be too intimidating, no room for error, as Ed and Mara will share. And so making sure there's no flawed logic, being as resourceful as possible, and making sure you have a clearly stated goal up front with that, with realistic milestones, I think is really the keys to success. And certainly, the fact that you're here means you're on the best start and best path possible. So hopefully that sort of shares, I'm coming at it from the trifecta of agency primarily, but also from an academic perspective as well as, of course, from the practical side of industry, about how to use this in the real world and ultimately get those products from the bench to the bedside. So I guess the ball was thrown in my court about what a 510K is. And, I have formal lectures on this very topic, so I'll do my best to keep it brief and certainly continue to keep the discussions flowing. But let's perhaps start in general with FDA regulated products, and then we can just again I will have to stop myself, so I'm gonna time it to just a few minutes here. Keep in mind the legal definition of a product is derived from what's called the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, and you probably have seen the disclaimer on every vitamin that's in your cabinet. It's actually called the DSHEA disclaimer, and it says these statements are not intended to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, or detect disease, because it falls into this quasi regulated category, which I don't want to get into. But the key is once you are marketing a product within the US, that falls within that definition, right? So let's drill into diagnosing or treating a disease primarily. That's where the FDA comes in. There's many different kinds of products, and we differentiate them primarily based on their route of administration. Drugs are orally taken, of course. Biologics are generally, cell and gene therapies, as well as the vaccines. And of course, devices are really where it gets interesting, and I might have a bias because that's where I was trained in the sense that it's over 1,800 plus counting different device categories and how they work. You have to understand that the interdisciplinary nature of integrating various forms of, really a lot of it is bundling things that already exist, and then they evolve, and the 510, and so kind of getting back to how we legally classify things is based on how you're labeled and what you want to do. And so let me conclude with devices, therefore, differentiate their mechanism of action from drugs and vaccines in that they don't achieve a primary mechanism of action by chemical interaction, right? So we're just going to table the drugs and biologics, really foods as well, and technically this is vet medicine and even tobacco products. And we're going to zone in on devices, right? Because that's where I think a lot of the tech is going. Happy to cover those other topics as well. And so it's within devices where there's a 3-tiered classification system that is risk-based, or class 1 devices, or where you're, believe it or not, common things that you wouldn't even imagine, like a Q-tip, a wheelchair, even a cane, are technically products regulated by the FDA as a class 1 medical device that is subject to formal registration and listing, as well as some aspects of what I like to call the abbreviated quality system regulations under what's called 21 CFR Part 820. Now, it gets more interesting when you get into the class 2 and 3 risk-based devices, whereby the class 2 is, let's just call it medium risk, differentiated from the class 3, life-sustaining, life-supporting, typically high risk. Again, the gray line between what divides that, and we'll talk, I think that's where, so Robin wants to take us right now. The 510K category in general is reflective of these class 2 medium risk devices that actually fall under what you think of as a grandfather clause, whereby they demonstrate something called substantial equivalence, which is actually responsible for the vast majority of the pathway of medical devices coming through to the commercial market within the US. Now, the trick here is within the substantial equivalence demonstration, you're basically showing I'm a me too, but there's a little bit of a art just as much as there is to a science with respect to, yes, if you're identical, which you oftentimes are never going to be, because then what's the commercial value? Although it does happen, even if you have a slight bell or whistle, typically as a side note, on average, your 510K is displaced by the next best thing between 18 to 24 months. Because again, all you have to do from the FDA side, you don't have to provide, typically only I think about 10% or less have to file clinical, have to have clinical data to support the 510K. It's really an engineering-based review and demonstration that you're technologically equivalent, with the caveat that, again, it's a mix of juggling what's called your predicate device, which is really the secret sauce, identifying what you're going to demonstrate substantial equivalence to. And there's an art to mixing and matching. So I don't want to get into that. I'm going to have to stop myself there, because hopefully that gives you a sense of, again, 510K is very appealing because it's what we call typically the least burdensome approach that a company will have to face, where you contrast it to, let's say, either a class 3 or de novo. I'm just going to categorize the de novo within the same category as when you typically require what's called a pre-market approval. Again, there's even different verbiage. When you get a 510K, it's a clearance, it's not an approval, just to show that, again, it's a matching exercise in a way versus FDA has reviewed this product and approved it. So I hope that answers the question as briefly as I can. Well, try to
It does,
explain
and
the
then some.
context.
So you had your Professor Helfgott hat on. So thank you. I hope that was kind of a speedy review, but I want to give the context now. I would love Ed and Mara, since you're both kind of pursuing this option, dig into more of like the strategy, not just what's required when you kind of conceive of the FDA regulation process as kind of a necessary part of your journey to get your product to market. But what's the strategy to the choice, and what are those factors when it comes to time, funding? Would love to hear that currently. And then I know you both, this is not your first trip through this process. So if any past experiences kind of informed your current strategy. So Mara, maybe we'll start with you. Would love to get your perspective, the entrepreneur's perspective.
Sure, absolutely. And I completely respect Jonathan's expertise. I'm going to use some layperson, quick and dirty terms. These are probably not all textbook definitions as I go. So correct me or jump in if I'm wrong, but put that caveat up front. So I think often entrepreneurs make the mistake of trying to pursue the fastest way through the FDA as the best path. And obviously time to market is important. As an entrepreneur, that's very important to me. I completely get that perspective and that bias. But as Jonathan was mentioning, when you go through, let's say you have a class 2 or higher device here, meaning there is some element of risk and you are going to need a clearance or an approval. There is some downsides to pursuing just a traditional 510K, which is the fastest of the clearances you can go through, because you do have to have a predicate. You do have to kind of define yourself as a bit of a Me Too. Maybe it's a Me Too plus, but a Me Too. Whereas if you are willing to do the extra work to pursue a PMA, which is the pre-market approval, and that's your kind of longest time to market, your biggest investment. It can be quite expensive, sometimes in clinical trials, or a 510K de novo, which is kind of a happy medium between those two. You get to have your own indication for use, which means that nobody else can do exactly what you can do. So it's a longer, bigger competitive advantage. It's a bigger kind of strategic moat over other competitors that are coming onto the market. So even though you might be able to try to kind of justify yourself as a 510K, you may find that competitively you do better going as a de novo. It often isn't that much longer of a pathway, and having an indication for use that it's going to carve you out a larger kind of strategic competitive toehold. The other thing to consider is along with the upfront investments, I mentioned that the cost and the time for these are pretty substantial. Are there other ways to signal to the market the unique value that you're bringing in partnership with the FDA? Things like applying for breakthrough device status, or for example, the STEP program. I think it's Safer Technologies program. I don't know what STEP stands for. I think it's Safer Technologies Program, but it's the STEP acronym. So those are things you can apply for. You have to do it before your 510K or your PMA submission, so that can extend your timeline. But that does, if you receive that designation, it is a tool you can use to communicate to the market that, hey, I have a really new breakthrough technology, or hey, the FDA has reason to believe that this is considerably safer than, another predicate out there. So it's not just all about, rushing through and time the market as fast as you can. It's about building a competitive moat, about building reasons to believe with your consumers to buy your product, and having the indication for use that's really right for you, that will allow your technology to be used in the safest way possible, but also in the way that's going to be the biggest match with your value proposition and the unmet need in the marketplace. that's kind of how I think about it. And Edward, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
So I think that my view on the regulatory strategy, which, and by the way, I like that combination of words, because I think there needs to be a strategy that you're implementing against. I think in order to make that happen well, my view is that the disciplined approach to actually writing the instructions for use as you begin your process is extraordinarily helpful. What claims are you making? What is the intended use case? What validation do you intend to offer to show that it's appropriate, it's safe and efficacious for that indication? I think there's nothing like that process of writing in draft form the instructions for use. By the way, in that process, it will prompt you to think about things that you may not have thought about beforehand. So you'll be looking at the competition, you'll be looking at the templates that the FDA offers and others have utilized for the structuring of the instructions for use. That's one thought. The second is, I think that there should be a bias, and this is a little cliche-ish, is to do what is right. So for most of my career, the FDA approval was not the most vigorous hurdle I needed to cross over. And I know that sounds strange. In many organizations, that is not the case. I had a lot of, I'll say with affection, cranky chief medical officers, many of whom work for me, that would not sign off on the release of the product until it passed their standards. And the ones that I have the greatest admiration for had standards that were much higher than the FDA's standards. I think that if there's a bias towards doing what's right and making sure that you can look in the mirror yourself and that those that have a critical review of the technology can answer the question themselves, yes, this is safe and efficacious. I would have my family member utilize this technology based upon that understanding. I think if that's the approach that's taken, I have found that things go very, very well with the interactions with the FDA. So starting with the instructions for use it as a guide to where is it you're going. And the second is to have that bar of doing what's right and make that a higher bar than regulatory approvals. Those are two thoughts I have at this point in the discussion.
Nice, I appreciate that. And Jonathan, thanks for dropping some links for the attendees in the chat as well. So I'll swing it back to Jonathan, but then also for Mara and Ed kind of being on the ground, going through it again. What are some key resources, if you can remember back when you were going through this for the very first time, what are some resources that are currently available that maybe weren't back then that entrepreneurs are maybe just not aware of? I think oftentimes we look at a behemoth of like any agency, and it's actually there. There are actually a lot of tools, resources into direct engagement, even with representatives. So what are you taking advantage of? Up to what point for the entrepreneurs? Then when do you really need to bring in kind of the expert? And then Jonathan, maybe in your space now as an educator, what are some readily available tools or resources for startups to just educate themselves about what decisions they need to make?
So it's really, I think, beyond the scope of me trying to identify resources beyond FDA.gov specific to your product. To be frank, what I was missing was the advice that Mara and Ed just gave. They nailed exactly what I've learned the hard way almost over the last decade when I've transitioned to the agency, because we all have our biases, pun intended here, like Ed, where it's a heliocentric view of the world. Everything revolves around the FDA. Yet within the industry, everything revolves around what you're labeling, how you're marketing your product. And oftentimes you have a platform technology. And I would use the word, it's exhilarating, as Ed was mentioning, when I have the whiteboard and ahead of me and all the different IFU statements and possibilities and routes. I mean, that is such an essential step for, I think, the innovator to have a plan, a strategic goal up front, not a general idea. I'm going to be opportunistic in what comes out. That will never work. because it's 1 in 10. IDEs are really, as we mentioned, the clinical studies, and great point in terms that Mara's mentioned. I think everybody needs to appreciate it. Regulatory piece is a part of it. And as Ed was mentioning, the checklist mentality is not going to work. First, build the highest quality product that serves the biggest need. Do the best you can, and then by default, you'll see how the regs, you'll comply with them. Because if you do the reverse, if you try to fit the square peg in the round hole, you're going to have an inferior product, and you're not even going to fully comply with the regs. Quality needs to be built into the process. It can't be tested in. And so it's that upfront right guidance. Understand where you're navigating. What are we committing to? Once we've gone through the exercise of identifying the IFU, taking into consideration beyond FDA, the reimbursement, the market access, the coverage, and the coding. What are we really going to charge? Just because we get FDA, as mentioned, just because you get a 510K, does that mean anyone's going to pay for it? Anyone's going to use it? So thinking about all of these things, what is the most, optimal path for your product as early on as possible is the key to survival and success. Because everybody can execute down the wrong path, and that's oftentimes what they do, which is difficult in and of itself. Running studies, and as mentioned, it's that trade-off advantage. You don't want to just be a me too, because everybody's chasing the next 510K. As I mentioned, it goes through a lot of cycles. But at the same time, it's a very substantive effort to run studies. I hate to say this, the word is miserable. I'm sad to say, because when I sat, at FDA and I pontificated about, how I want studies to look for and, clearly articulated endpoints and all that. And then when I got to the real world and had budgets and literally patients dying on you and things just happen and you have to make it work, we're all patients, as it was mentioned. So we really all have to be, committed to the right thing. And so as innovators, it's key to know what the plan is up front. And yeah, you're gonna have to understand all the implications for how you're defining what your product is. Recognizing what you're committing to as your first goal isn't necessarily all you have to be. You can have other versions. You can expand your indications for use once you get something. But that first thing, make sure, as Mara and Ed were mentioning, it's carefully thought out, and that's going to drive your pathway. That's going to drive the level of evidence that you need. And then based off of that, of course, you sort of have that spectrum. If you're thinking of class 3 de novo, Herculean effort, but the trade-off is worth it, because clearly it's novel. It doesn't exist anymore. You're either creating a new device category, literally. That's what de novo means. Or, you're not demonstrating I'm like these other combo of existing devices where I'm substantial equivalent via the 510K clearance pathway. So hopefully that kind of, again, just really reflective over, if everyone was taking careful notes of what Mara and Ed said, the rest are the details. Do your diligence up front. And if it works, right? That's the heartbreak for me that I've seen it when I was at the agency side of things. And remember, there's an art to dealing with the agency. They don't answer open-ended questions, right? Okay, how do you want to see my study design? No, you have to carefully think through, what am I proposing? How am I going to negotiate with the agency? Plan A, B, and C, and recognize that, if you're doing something that hasn't been done before, by default, that you have to have, again, you have to have the right rationale and evidence to back it up. And so that's what it is. The arguments that you make is not going to be driven on the evidence that you have. It's all about peer-reviewed published literature is the highest form. That's your typical gold standard. Of course, there's, as mentioning, studies, you want, even though you might be told to avoid your clinical study, not only might it be inevitable, it might help you understand your product better. So you have to make these decisions very smartly, as Mara and Ed were saying. So I can go on and on, but I really think it's there. It's really doing your homework always, not taking anybody's word for it. At FDA, I would say, in God we trust, everyone else must provide documentation. So, don't take my word for it. Go look at these things up for yourself, do your own research, and make the decisions that are best for your product.
Thanks, Jonathan. Mara, what kind of advice would you have of where to get started before you start maybe paying to bring in the expertise? How can an early stage founder with limited funding, start educating themselves?
Sure. So, I know this is obvious and others mentioned it, but the FDA website does have abundant resources. There's the actual, documentation or regulation, so CFR 21. But there's also a ton of guidance documents. If you just go through the website, it's maybe not the fanciest website in the world, but if you dig through and take your time, the information is there. And I think honestly, they've done a pretty good job of putting all of the directions and resources there in a step-by-step manner if you're willing to take the time and dig around. So that's one resource I would absolutely start with, is just taking the time to really read that documentation. There's no substitute for that. In terms of thinking through kind of like what is the process and what other resources there are, particularly if you're very capital strapped, I don't want to go into the whole kind of what it is to start a company, but making sure you have your intellectual property locked up early is really important before you start making disclosures about it, because if you're going out in the world and testing your ideas with people, that can often be a disclosure. So I would encourage early entrepreneurs, if you think you have intellectual property, lock that up early. Second is getting in front as many of your users as you can as early as possible, making sure that people really are resonating with your offering, that they're trying it, they're getting feedback from all of the stakeholders. I'm in surgical devices, so yes, the surgeon is very important, but you can't forget the anesthesiologist, you can't forget the nurse, everyone who's going to have hands on the device. I want to kind of get specific to your resource question. So another resource that came to mind that's really helpful in the process, it can also be your testing vendors. So I'm seeing in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions about how much does an FDA submission cost? And that's such a wide answer. If you're doing a very basic, low risk 510K versus a very, very complex, high risk PMA, those are, it could range so widely. But pretty much any of those things, 510K or a PMA, there's some basic testing you're going to need to do, like biocompatibility testing. If there's anything electronic, you're going to have to do IEC 60601 testing, packaging testing. And there are labs that exist in the world that do this testing for you, external validated or kind of approved labs that do this testing. And they also have a wealth of knowledge because it's their whole business to produce documentation. So if you're feeling really uncertain about how do I tackle demonstrating safety for my electronics, anyone who does IEC testing is going to be a huge asset, and many of them have consultants that will help too. So that's another resource that gives you a lot of bang for your buck. The cost of actually submitting a 510K or PMA is pretty minimal, particularly if you're a small business, which I think is under 10 million in revenue by the FDA. That's not going to be the thing that's expensive. It is all the testing and the product development that you're going to have to do, getting your tooling, all those things. That's where the capital goes in. So that's widely variable product to product. But I would think you could save a lot of money just actually taking the time to read the website, trying to do a first pass of some of these things yourself, and then bringing in an FDA consultant to kind of review your first draft. Because as Ed said, this is about you understanding what you want your device to be used for, you understanding the risk, and kind of from the ground up, you having an understanding of what your goals are. So you don't need to be paying other people to do all that for you. You really need to have control.
Thanks, Mara. And Ed, I know you've gone through this multiple times. So maybe even thinking about a past experience where things didn't go well, and what could you have done differently, whether it was a resource, bringing somebody in earlier, maybe just a different twist on a similar question. Really appreciated your responses, Mara.
So I'll echo the FDA websites, the internet, and actually reading the guidance documents and reading the regulations. It can be done. If I can do it, others can do it. You can read it, and it will actually tell you directly what the criteria are for different categorizations, etc. So that I would echo those. The other wasn't mentioned is I heavily utilize pre-sub, so pre-submission interactions with the FDA directly. As Jonathan had mentioned, there's an art to doing that. So you don't show up and throw up. You need to come in with assumptions that you are testing, not open-ended questions that you expect them to answer for you.
You called it a negotiation, I believe. Do you agree with it being like an actual negotiation?
No question.
Yeah.
I think that people need to realize that what the FDA tells you in a pre-sub interaction is not binding upon the FDA. And so just be aware of that what you hear could change. And I have experienced, quite profoundly changes between what we heard during our pre-sub and what was actually thought to be acceptable later on. But if you have an ongoing dialogue with the FDA, then you can have them influence your thinking, and it gives you an opportunity to influence theirs. So I don't want to club that being prepared for a pre-submission is very important, and that will likely require expertise in order to do that well, especially if you haven't done it before. But to Mara's point earlier, the more that you can do yourself, where you have drafted the instructions for use, you have done the research about the actual legislation, the documentation that's available. When you then interact with experts, it will be a much more effective and efficient interaction. It won't cost you nearly what it would cost than if you just show up and say, I need your help. And same with the FDA. They will not answer your open-ended questions. So you need to go in there with assumptions that you're testing. But if you've done your homework, those can be very efficient. And that's what it takes to be successful as an entrepreneur, is to be very efficient with the monies that you do spend. The other thing I'll mention is that typically I have found in my own network or my extended network, I can always find the experts to talk to. And almost all those initial interactions are gratis, right? They're there to help you. If they're interested in getting your business eventually, they'll seed you with some guiding thoughts to want you to work with them. So I found you can go pretty far downstream on a promise to do work with someone in the future if you realize success. So those are some additional thoughts I'll throw into the hopper for
Appreciate that. And then Ed, I want to stick with you too, because I think one thing that's important, again, thinking of it as kind of a strategy overall, what role does your FDA kind of regulatory strategy play when you go for fundraising? What are the questions you're getting from VCs? How does that inform that, what questions are you getting from, I know you're fundraising now, which is why I'm asking you the question.
I would say that 60 to 70% of the time when I'm interacting with potential investors, they'll ask, what's your regulatory pathway? And they'll want to know why you think that is the pathway. And so I think having done some homework about your thinking about your instructions for use and therefore the pathway that would be associated with that, I think is essential to be able to answer that question. If you answer you don't know, or I'll get back to you, it's not going to go well with investors. They're going to expect that you have thought through your pathway to commercialization from a regulatory perspective, because it has an impact on what is your commercialization date, right? If it's a PMA, it's a multi-year experience versus a 510K, which the submission process is within 90 days, from submission to response. In theory, okay, we all know that the FDA, what they'll do is they'll extend the timeline by coming back with questions even the day before the 90 days, right? So at 89 days, we'll get, a list of 10 questions. And what they've done is they've just extended the clock by another 90 days. So you just have to be aware that there are mechanisms that the FDA can use to structure their workload. If your submission is in September, the last day of September, you're going to have a heck of a time getting it done in 90 days for a 510K, because they're all jammed up with everyone else doing all their submissions at the end of the year. So the likelihood that you're going to come back at 89 days with questions is very high if you do it at that time of year, right? So those are the things that people that have been through this process a number of times will be able to guide you if you ask them. And that's the reason why I do think getting regulatory expertise is important. But there are ways you can do it if you're spending time to educate yourself to do it efficiently. So that way you're effective with the dollars that you are spending in getting that expertise that you need.
Appreciate that. Mara, I don't know if you had anything to add kind of on the VC front, what you're hearing from that community, whether it's the FDA process or just generally, where you need to be kind of in the commercialization process before you're kind of viable to go out to private capital.
Let's see. I think thinking from a funding perspective, if you can utilize what's called non-dilutive funding or grants for some of your early work, that is broadly across the board the best thing you can do for your company. So if early on you can get some grant funding, either from the NIH or there's SBIR funding out there, or even like your regional economic development agencies, perhaps within your state, things like that will have opportunities because they're excited about new companies starting in your region. That can be a great way to offset some of the costs of, bringing in an early FDA consultant or regulatory consultant to help you with some of these questions and guide you through some of these early decisions. But typically, when you're in a pre-seed or a seed round of capital, you're not at FDA stage yet, unless I'm sure there's some exception to the rule, but you're very much more the early product development, still finding your product market fit, proof of concepting, or kind of technology feasibility. So yes, absolutely, a funder is going to want to know what your strategy is. They're going to want to know that you have a pathway and understand the kind of risk reward that you're signing them up for. Is it a PMA, which is big risk, lots of capital to get there, but big reward, or a 510K, which is a smaller risk, but a smaller reward? So you need to have that, but in your early rounds of financing, you're often not kind of at that FDA stage yet. It can, however, drive who you should be talking to. Often venture capital firms or kind of institutional investors are looking to take really big bets. They're looking for those big risks. So they might be better suited for a PMA style submission. They're often writing bigger checks and they're looking for that 10x kind of unicorn return. Whereas angel investors are often more of a better fit for a lower risk profile, such as a 510K. So you can also use your regulatory strategy to influence the type of people you're approaching for investment. The last comment I want to make on strategy, because we're kind of talking about this idea that it's not just a submission, black box thing in, thing out, but your regulatory strategy should be very much part of your business. That's implementing your quality system, your risk, your product design, your fundraising. Is that I think it's very helpful to think of the FDA and any external regulatory approval bodies not in an adversarial way, but as in partners. I mean, they exist to make sure your product is safe and effective. And that's what all of us, if you're an entrepreneur in the healthcare space, you're not here just to make money. You're here because you believe in the mission, you believe in the ethos, you're trying to improve patients' lives, you're trying to improve patient outcomes. At least everyone I know in the spaces, that's what they're doing here. So the last thing I want as an entrepreneur is to inadvertently put a device in the world that is going to harm patients or have adverse events or drive negative outcomes. And the fact that we get a partner looking over our shoulder that's going to help make sure that things are safe and effective, that are going to make sure we didn't overlook anything, I think is a great thing. I like the idea that when I am unconscious in a surgery, every device that's in my body has gotten a second look from some sort of agency making sure it's safe. So where I have seen things, you asked about what you've seen go wrong. When people try to kind of pull one over or see if they can get away with, or maybe not disclose some pertinent info to the FDA, that's where I've seen things go really wrong. I think that people can smell that out pretty quickly, and it creates more of an adversarial relationship. If you are forthright in your goals, what the patient outcomes you're trying to get, and your plan to get there, and see the FDA as collaborators to help get you on the most effective path, I think that's a better way to kind of make it that strategic positive for you and for the business.
I appreciate that, Mara. And we have to go to Jonathan. He's doing his best Bob Ross impression behind us. So I definitely want to see what you drew for us. But maybe I think one thing that's coming out is at a certain point, you need to get that expert in the door, just to kind of gut check, sense check, and make sure even having them in the room for some of these conversations. So definitely think this could be a great conversation for you, Jonathan. I know the work that you're doing with your new firm, kind of Healthcare Innovation Catalyst. You guys do a lot of support with startups, but how do you snip out kind of that right experts? I know Ed found, he's been in this business for years and years and has that network built in that he can probably easily find the right person, but how do you suss out kind of that right consultant that's going to be the person that you need to go forward? So Jonathan, please, maybe answer that question, but then also you can kind of point to the little schematic that you've got for us. I'm very curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlie Munger said it best. Knowing what you don't know is more useful than brilliance. So the first step is knowing when expertise is necessary versus I could figure this out on my own. Now, you don't want to be too overconfident, which can also be a poison pill that you swallow. So knowing your own limitations, understanding the nature of your own product and what is the gaps in expertise that's necessary. I don't know if there's any magical formula. I think Mara and Ed would agree. It's brute force. It's 24/7. You read books, you read articles, and you send cold emails, and you just talk to people, and hopefully you just put yourself in the right place at the right times. And you just, I don't know how else to explain it. Like, there's in terms of who's the best of the best, who they are, and they're not always accessible. So you have these tiers of experts, if you will. I don't care who they are, if they're at Harvard, Hopkins, all that matters is how credible is the evidence and the information. That's what's key. It's not about the individual, because I've seen it both ways. I've seen folks with the best credentials not really give the best advice, and folks that will easily get overlooked understand the intimacy of the technology and navigating, et cetera. So there's no one thing about here's the litmus test to determine, in my experience, about here's the right expert. It's just a combination of just the nuances of your own, your own niche and word of mouth, and just seeing for yourself. Here are the published people. Here's who knows their stuff. And I don't know. I hope that's a sufficient enough answer. But again, I can't help myself to Mara's point in terms of this is, almost borrowing from the same information that I would train at the agency, the folks where we'd explain data integrity issues as being primarily driven 99% by user errors, not understanding how the system was designed, case of slipped fingers, transcription errors. That's the vast majority of all sorts of quality issues. And as mentioned, if you're in this industry, you have to be committed to the highest standards of quality because patients' lives are at stake. Now, it's very unfortunate, but in all industries, there's those less than 1% of the bad actors. That is what's representative of what I like to classify as intentional data fabrication or fraud. People doing bad things on purpose. Now, you want to avoid any problems, of course, through, as mentioned, building quality into your process, having effective what's called CAPA's corrective and preventive actions to identify problems in near real time and respond to them, of course, eliminate their root cause. And, that's a science in and of itself. But the key is to recognize that just because there are bad players out there, the vast majority of the folks are genuinely trying to put good products on the market. So even as a former compliance officer, when you're in a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You have to also understand how that aligns with the public health mission, right? Agencies risk-based, so they focus on those activities that are going to benefit the public the most, right? And reduce the harm. So key is to avoid having any problems and recognizing that even when there are issues, they typically, are indicative of problems at the organizational level. And you hate to say it, but you go on the FDA's wall of shame if you do get, publicly listed with a warning letter, if they do find violations. So that's the whole key, is you don't want to be problematic ever once you're on the market. Now, to Ed's point, just a little bit about navigating through, I love to call this my triangle, where there's a clear delineation, as we mentioned, of the law, what's applicable based on how you're defining your product, and therefore the applicable regulatory requirement. But there's a dividing line between what people think about, just so everyone knows the terminology, of guidance documents, which are technically recommendations, but there's a little buyer beware clause that really, if the guidance applies, it's probably going to be, in my experience, even more difficult for you to demonstrate how you ultimately achieve compliance to the applicable regulations if you don't follow the recommendations in the guidance. Now, what's very often is you're a patchwork of guidances, because a little bit applies here and a little bit applies here. So if it was that easy, then you wouldn't really have something special. So of course, it has to be somewhat challenging for it to be competitive. So navigate, this is actually what you navigate through, right? You filter it. Okay, what law applies? Am I a device? Okay, class. Oh, what reg? Well, gee, I could go in different routes. And what are the applicable guidances? Am I a surgical device? Am I an implantable device? Am I an imaging device? Am I a neuro device, etc.? Am I a wearable or am I not? Am I a wellness device? Am I trying to just get the first MVP, the version of my product on the market? You have to understand what the policies are as applicable for your product. And that's what it takes. It takes you doing your homework. And to your question, Robin, filling in the gaps of, okay, here's my limitations. Here's the expertise that I need in order to develop this essential strategy that Ed and Mara were saying has to guide your whole plan. And it is, I hate to say it, it starts with a government website. And, hopefully it ends with a product that we can all benefit from, whether it's directly or as patients or friends and family, because it's again, an interdisciplinary effort. We all need to be in this together. Ed gave, exceptional advice. You get a couple freebies with a lot of these experts that are looking to charge you $500, $600, $700 an hour. And if you're paying careful enough attention and you ask enough right questions, you can't usually get everything you need, but you can get most of what you need. And so Godspeed, I know we're coming up at the top of the hour. It's really exciting again, and fast to failure too. I think understanding when a product just doesn't work, it was an idea, it was a concept, we had the data, there's no signal there. It happens. That's research, that's science. Understanding that's the nature of the life cycle of these products is also key. Now, of course, everybody wants winners. So, we do our best to learn from the experience and try to see how we can, whether it's the next version or integrate or learn from the pitfalls of the failure, what to avoid, and hopefully you can apply the keys to success.
Well,
Hey,
thanks.
Robin, maybe I'll just add one more quick comment. I think there's two different types of expertise that you'll come across. There's one type of expertise, they tend to have legal backgrounds or associated with a law firm, and they're more at the lower end of that triangle that Jonathan was just talking about. And they are very good at, I would say, very early stage, in other words, which pathway you're going to pursue, and the late stage, which is implementation. A lot of those folks are actually ex-FDA folks. And so when you walk into the room with them on your side, I'll push back on Jonathan. There's a lot of credibility that you get if it's one of those individuals that you won't get if it's not. However, there's a different type of expertise, which is more on the strategy side. And those folks typically will have a clinical background. So you're trying to think through how you're actually going to do the clinical work that would give you the dossier for submission. And that's not a legal expertise, that's a clinical expertise. And so I often think of those as being two separate types of expertise. They're very rarely in one individual. It's usually two different types of talent that you need to mingle together as appropriate as you go through the process.
That's awesome, Ed. I really appreciate that. And Jonathan, thank you so much for kind of giving us that framework to talk through. So I wish we could go on. I'm learning a lot from all of you, and I know the audience already in some of the chat. There are some questions that are outstanding, so I know we're going to have to wrap here. But what we are going to do is share everybody. How do you reach out to these folks? So we already shared, check out what they're doing. Some amazing stuff from all three of them now, all entrepreneurs. Leading kind of their own things. So take a look at the websites. We put in their LinkedIn if you want to connect with them outside of this event. I know we answered some questions as we went, and we left a few kind of unanswered. So we'll do our best to make sure that we reach out to all of you. So the last thing, of course, thanking all three guests, really appreciated it. Mara, Jonathan, Ed, clearly we brought the right people that could share their experiences and really actionable, more importantly than anything, actionable feedback to the folks that are kind of going through it. And you could tell from the questions, we have a lot of folks at the starting block when it comes to taking the leap. So those of you that want to kind of stay engaged, here's a few ways across both JLabs and Blue Knight. Healthtech, if you want to find out what we're up to. I see a lot of our entrepreneurs from our Startup Studio program that are in the audience. And if you want to find out how to tap into our supporting networks from Blue Knight and Healthtech, please do. We are launching on the other side of Healthtech. We are starting a quantum initiative and program program with the University of Maryland. So if you're curious about that, join us tomorrow. We have an information session for a new program for emerging quantum technologies and companies. And then last but not least, find out more. We are going to continue this series with Blue Night, the last in the series that is focused in for health tech entrepreneurs. So we're going to be taking the leap on the next stage of the journey. You know, what do you need to think about kind of post FDA as you continue up the commercialization pathway? So stay tuned. We're going to come back this summer in August, and we're going to have another bench of amazing entrepreneurs and guest speakers. So again, please welcome me and another huge warm thank you to our guest today. You can find the recording. It'll be on YouTube afterwards. Really loved the discussion today, everybody. Really appreciate it, and have an awesome rest of the afternoon to everybody else.